Good morning, folks. Welcome back to another Truth Factor discussion. This morning, we'll be continuing our study through 1 Timothy. We are in chapter 3, verse 1. Before we begin, we want to talk just a few minutes about the passing of Brother Bob Myhan. Bob had been a part of this study, what was it, Tom, since 2023? Almost about 2 years.
Yeah. October of 2023, Bob held a gospel meeting for us. And he joined me that day, and then we added him afterwards. So.
Okay. It didn't seem like that long, but it was. You're right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And we enjoyed Bob's participation in the studies. He always brought a very beneficial way of looking at the text, and the comments and participation was very beneficial. But that wasn't his first rodeo. He has been with Answering Religious Error for several years now.
Oh yeah, I think Bob was one of the initial ones that that's run by Brian Garlock, or he's the one that purchased that and built it. And I believe that Bob was one of the initial ones on that. It's been around for 10 years or more. So
okay. And he was doing his own weekly study about, was it Bob Bible Basics?
Yeah, Bob's Bible Basics.
Yeah.
So and he did that for us. So he's done a lot of online work, and the thing about Bob was, he engaged in some debates and some other things. So he was very prolific with that, and he was very knowledgeable.
Yeah.
As he was teaching and so on. So he was, and of course he was single most of his life, as far as I know. So.
Right. I believe, I want to double check this real quick. But when Bob joined us back in 2023, it wasn't the first time he had been on Truth Factor with us. There was, and this now goes several years back, he had been involved, you mentioned the debate, he had been involved in the debate, and he and Brian had joined us on Truth Factor for a discussion kind of over that subject there. I thought I had it as a standalone study, but I'm not seeing it right off the bat right now. But that was probably upwards to 10 years ago too. So.
Yeah, I couldn't remember what that study was dealing with. Was it the realized eschatology? Also known as AD, or?
No, it was the one that talked about what was it? Substitutionary.
Atonement, yeah.
Atonement,
yeah.
That or something similar to that. That still doesn't sound right. You'd have thought, substitute punishment for our sins. It was an open forum. It was episode 106, and it was 10 years ago. And we had Brian and Bob join us that day on Truth Factor for that. So if you're curious about that, Bob looked a lot younger. Well, we all did anyway. But go look for episode 106. You can go to truthfactor.com and click on archives. And then you'll have the whole list. You click on topical studies. You'll see everything there topically that we discussed so far. And you'll have the various book studies. That's truthfactor.com, and then click on archives to look at that. But it's been a long time. We were really saddened by his passing. We didn't quite realize how severe his health issues was in recent months, but he had some heart issues that had developed. And as David says in the chat room, he will definitely be missed. So Chris Kramer, who's part of ARE, shared this. I'll bring it up here real quick. He said, we're going to have a memorial type show October 28th at 7:00 p.m. Central Time on Answering Religious Error. This is for Bob, so come and join in the chat, share some stories. I believe, Chris, y'all will be streaming it to both Facebook and YouTube. And I was speaking with Brian earlier, and we can follow up once you get this set in stone as far as get the stream established. We can put it on YouTube, and if y'all would like, put it on truthfactor.com. And if you would like, we can even embed the live stream from YouTube there, just to kind of give one other way of people viewing it. The only downside to that is I don't have a chat portal established there. on truthfactor.com. But we can, if y'all would like to do that, at least put it there also. But something we can talk about that. All right, any other thoughts? That is the 28th at 7 o'clock
Yeah,
p.m.
Tuesday the 28th. Yeah,
Answering Religious Error at Facebook and on YouTube as well.
exactly. So.
Okay. So this morning, we have an extra guest with us today. Paul is either out recuperating or prepping for his next surgery. And Brendan, not certain about. And Brian, he is currently out of town, so they aren't with us here today. But Tom, introduce your guest to us.
Yeah, right. I have. Oh, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, I'm Joe Price. I work with the church, the Vegas Drive congregation in Las Vegas, Nevada. Been there 3 years this month, and it's hold the gospel meeting here with the Rose Avenue Church in Bellflower, California. If you're nearby, we invite you to come, and appreciate the opportunity to sit in and be a part of this today.
Yeah, exactly. And all the lessons up to this point, they're on our YouTube page. And most of the audios, you can go to roseavenue.org, and the audios I have a problem with last night's, but everything else is going to be made available. So you can go to our YouTube page, and I'm eventually going to get them up on our Facebook page. So okay. I ran into some snags with that a little earlier this week. So I wish these platforms would just leave us alone and just start something and do it the way you've always done it. And
technology.
Yeah. Technology. I mean, when you get past 50 years of age, I'm in my 60s. You get past that, technology is not what it used to be. So.
I mean, they've miniaturized it a lot, and we can do an incredible amount of stuff, but they have to keep changing it, so we'll keep coming back and buying more stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, everybody in the audience understands that John is the tech whiz among us. I don't know how much Caleb knows, but but I know John's our tech whiz and stuff like that. So.
Well, and I feel like so far behind with what's going on out there.
Right. Oh yeah.
Man.
Yeah, you got a job.
That's right.
You got a job that won't let you keep up with it.
That's right.
I tell John all the time that wasn't part of preacher training. All this camera stuff and this live streaming and video recording. I missed that class.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Right.
Well,
even though there is something to be said about the electronic gospel today, if in reaching people. I mean, it's obviously a very powerful tool, and of course, that's a whole discussion within itself. But.
Oh yeah. Who is the one who did the executable sermon outlines?
Mark Copeland.
Mark Copeland. And that goes back many years. I mean, it was basically distributed as all text format.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, long time now. It's been around. All right. That was the one good thing that came out of COVID. It turned some reluctant preachers into TV evangelists overnight, like that, Okay. Let's talk about 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. As Paul continues his letter here to Timothy, he's getting ready to get into the aspect of the leadership of the local congregation. And the term leadership, oftentimes we think about someone that takes the lead, and using Paul's terminology could potentially, with abuse, lord it over people. But the role of the eldership is more of a protector type role, a shepherding type role, and we'll talk about that as we get through here. But Paul's instructions to Timothy at this point isn't so much about the work of the eldership per se, as it is the qualifications of those who would desire to serve in this capacity. And so before we kind of read the text, well, let's go ahead and read the text. And then we're going to step back and do just a quick overview of what terminologies the New Testament uses in regards to this same role within a local church there. Joe, would you mind reading for us? We're reading in 1 Timothy 3, And let's read down through verse 7. Will be a good stopping point for now.
This is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine and not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil.
All right, thank you, sir. Okay, so when we before we start here, let me remind everyone, if you're viewing from home and you've joined us on Facebook or YouTube, you're welcome to comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts as we go through the study. You can comment via whether you're on Facebook in the comment section or YouTube in the chat section. If you'd like to email us, you can send those to questions@truthfactor.com. Or you can email us individually, use our first name followed by @truthfactor. Tom is the exception. His is simply Tom instead of Thomas. But Tom@truthfactor.com. Let him know what you think about what he has to say. All right, so we talk about in Paul's instructions to Timothy regarding the work of the local church here, and kind of putting it to Brian's words, instructions on how to set up a local congregation, if you would. He talks about this position of a bishop. Now, the term bishop that is translated here in the text is the Greek word episkopi, and some translations will render it as simply overseer as well. When we step aside and we look at how the Bible refers to this, we see that it's not quite the way the denominational world kind of breaks this down. You'll have many in the denominational world where the pastor is essentially the head of the church, a singular man. And then depending on the religious group, you may have deacons then who are under him, and then board of directors. And then if you go into the Catholic side of things, you definitely take a different branch regarding a overseer or role of the leadership there within their churches there. But there are several Bible passages where we see this term being used. So got a handy dandy chart. Hopefully it'll be legible for those watching at home. So Tom, here in Paul's letter to Timothy, he uses the term bishop in verse 1 there. But when he writes his letter to Titus, he will also use the term elders, which is presbyteros, which is very similar, of course, not similar, but it's a different term than the term bishop. But when we look at the fact that Paul uses the term elders and bishop in his letter to Titus, what does that kind of tell us about these two words? That's a very open-ended question. My apologies.
Yeah, basically what it tells us is that the two terms are used for the same office. And the point is, like you said, as you've got it up there, there's actually three words. There's three different words associated with the chart. You got the idea of pastor, which is actually the most confusing of the words to me, because poimen is actually a word for a shepherd, But then you've got the elders, the elder, and then you've also got the idea of an overseer, and all three of those are different Greek words, but when they're used contextually in the same context, they're talking about the same individual, and so you could do that cross comparison between Titus and Timothy from that standpoint. So that's my initial thoughts on that.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, when you compare 1 Timothy 3:1, Titus 1:5-7, then in Acts 20:17 and 28, especially Titus and Acts reference, you see both those words, elders and overseers, or bishop, which is the same or a very similar word to that of overseers. And Peter uses the same idea in 1 Peter 5 too, when he references elders and overseers.
And incidentally, John, in those two texts, Acts 20 and 1 Peter 5, they use all three words.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, in one sense or another. I mean, you've got the idea of typically talking about the work of it. The idea of the bishop is the overseer.
Yeah.
And, from that standpoint, and I think what the Acts 20 uses the expression, if I had that over Acts 20 and what was the word?
Acts 20, 17, he uses elders. Yeah. Verse 28, he uses overseers and shepherds.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you got both of them. Yeah, oversee, and it says to shepherd the church of God. So I mean, they're used interchangeably of the same people. But of course, in our religious world, we've made distinctions between those. And I assume it started with Catholicism over the course of the first 2 to 3 centuries. After the establishment of the church, they made a distinction between elders and bishops. So they would, I guess, one bishop or one elder in a congregation would rise to a position of prominence over the others and supposedly would represent the eldership of a congregation. And then the representatives would get together and eventually they gave them the title of bishop. And so a bishop and an elder became 2 different offices and those kind of things. And of course, the idea of the pastor, I really don't know the history of when that developed into the concept in denominationalism, where you have the single man running things. I don't know the history. I don't know if you do or not. But
no, not particularly. But it would develop in the Protestantism, I believe.
Yeah, and the Protestantism and stuff like that. So.
I think it was Ignatius, and there's some dispute about this a little bit apparently, but Ignatius, in some of his letters towards just the start of the 2nd century, I think, maybe the early days of the end of the 1st century. Anyway, in some of the letters, like to his letter in the church in Ephesus, he addressed it to the deacons, the elders, and the bishop. And so some suggest that indicates that at least early on, I say in the early days there, towards the end of the 1st century, started the 2nd, there may have been some already have a singular ruling individual there.
Right.
But one thing on my chart that I kind of forgot to, or not forgot, but Caleb, you were talking about Acts 20, verse 28 there. So yeah. The idea of shepherds being used in reference to this role is seen in Acts 4:11 when he uses the term pastors there. And it's a similar Greek word to that which is used of shepherd in Acts 20, verse 28. This is talking about the role of them. But what I found interesting is 1 Peter 5:2, where again he talks about shepherding the flock that are among you, so that when the chief shepherd appears. Well, that, of course, is talking to Christ, but it's interesting to see that comparison between elders who are shepherds and the chief shepherd who sets the example for us, in effect. We are to, so that we can stand before him if we uphold our position properly there. But that was interesting. So, bishop, elders, overseers, pastors, all scriptural terms. Go ahead, Caleb.
Yeah. Well, I think the key thing that people need to realize, and we could spell it out as plain as possible, and people will still go over their heads, is these are not separate offices, but they're just different descriptions of one word. And I think the easiest place to look at that is Acts chapter 20, because Paul, what does he do? He calls the elders from Ephesus to come down, and then he says, they have the work of overseers and to shepherd. So he uses all 3 terms to describe the same people. So it's the same position. We're talking about the same group of men. They're all doing the same job. And it's important for us to understand that we're not separating these terms out. If I said, hey, you're a preacher, but you're also an evangelist and you're also a minister, and we're talking about the same thing. We're just talking about different things that you're doing in that position. And it's not It's not a title, it's a work that they're doing. I think that's
Yes.
another key thing we gotta point out there. That's what he says there in verse 1 of chapter 3, that it's a fine work that they desire to do. It is a work of service to God.
Yeah.
Now, the other point I always like to make, there is, it's for men who aspire to the office. So we're not trying to compel people. We're not trying to force somebody into it. You have to want to do it. And it's much like the Sermon on the Mount. Who's Jesus talking to on the Sermon on the Mount? Well, he's talking to his disciples. So people want to look at all the blessings Jesus talks about, and they don't want to apply it to those who are his disciples are going to be blessed. Same thing here. You have to go back and look, who is he talking about? He's talking about those who desire to serve. And that's a key part we have to consider at the beginning.
Which kind of brings about a little bit of a sticky issue in one respect, because you look at the amount of humility that is required of the individual who's to serve as an elder, but yet it's okay for him to desire a good work. Of course, we got to understand it in the text of he doesn't desire it for his own self glorification, but he desires to serve in the capacity to serve the church this way.
Right. Yeah. And John, I think you bring up a good point there. There are men who are qualified to serve as elders and so on, but they're somewhat hesitant because in their mind that word desire is a strong word, and they don't have a strong enough of a desire. But and so I kind of, and maybe I'm off on this. But I kind of take a position that if you desire to see the church grow, and you have the ability to serve in that office, and you're qualified, from that standpoint, the desire might not be used in the term that we think of desire as in, I got to have this, because by the way, there's a lot of people out there that desire the office that are not qualified. And desire is the only qualification they have. But you got the idea. But you got the idea of somebody that they see the church, and while they really would prefer not to serve as an elder, they see the church needs elders. They've got the ability, and they're willing to step into the role. I'm not talking about being forced, or reluctant, but they're willing to step into the role. But it's not about them, which is the whole point. Sometimes when we think of the desire, we think about, this is just something I want. And by the way, it's not wrong early on, and this is when you need to start desiring. And I think this is why we have a crisis today, in churches, is because we've got young people that are not desiring to be qualified so that they can serve as an elder. So that's just my thoughts on that word desire, some of the different flavors associated with it.
Yeah.
That's a good point. I'm going to kind of take this a little bit a tangent, but I'm going to blame it on Tom. I think that's a good point that he makes, because think about if we have a young man and we want to try to get him, we think that he might become a good song leader. All right, so we'll start kind of help urging him to go in the direction that isn't technically a role within the scriptures as far as someone to lead singing. We just say by inference, I guess, that you'd have to have someone to lead singing. Or, and I think this is probably even a better example, we train young men to lead prayers, which I think is maybe a greater responsibility on them than leading singing, because it's them praying to God on behalf of the congregation. And scripture reading, the same thing. These aren't roles of authority, I recognize that. But with all these, we help to train our young men in that area. It makes sense over the long term to make sure they're striving for that goal to be able to serve in that capacity. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, to expand on Tom's point, if you're desiring to do something, that is a good thing to desire.
Yeah.
It's not a negative thing. Coveting would be the negative word we would use.
Yeah,
But we're all
Yes.
aspiring to walk as Christ walked, to be imitators of Christ. And if you're set your mind on things above, like Paul says, then you're naturally going to want to desire those things, that you're going to want to desire to fulfill God's plan
Right.
and to serve him all the more. As you see the day drawing near, we should be wanting to grow. So, don't hinder yourself. Now, some people take that as, I'm not qualified enough, or, we'll go through these qualifications, but, they nitpick it to death and say, well, I'm just not qualified. And that's a different discussion. Maybe they're discouraged that way. But I don't think everybody should have that desire. Whether you're going to meet these qualifications or not, you should have the desire to serve. Go ahead, Tom.
Now, actually, I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Joe.
Well, of course, the idea of desire and the root is to crave, and so is a craving to be of service. And comments already made to that point, and yet the understanding the work of an elder becomes important, so that the desiring the good work, you actually understand what that work is, and it will require aspects of leadership at times, disciplinary. One verse, Hebrews 13:17, obey those who have the rule over you and watch on behalf of souls. So we can dive into the work, this speaking of the qualifications, but these qualifications indicate the one is equipped to actually be overseeing and feeding and tending to the souls of the members of the congregation. And so the desire is not to hold a position, it is to do a work. And that is key to lay that foundation as you start discussing the qualifications, as these indicate that ability to do the work that God gives the elders.
Right. Yeah, and building on what Joe just said there, when you think about the importance of the church, one of the things that an elder has to understand, or every member ought to understand, is how important the church is, what the church is, from that standpoint. And so, when you think about what is the ultimate desire of the elder, the ultimate desire of the elder is for the church to glorify God and to magnify Christ. Because we call ourselves churches of Christ, and I always emphasize this: it's not a title. It's a description, and I'll tell you now, that's the desire the elder has to have. It's not about him from that standpoint, other than achieving to that, because you care about the church and you want the church to thrive. And by the way, the other thing you got to build into this is the fact, and we got to understand this: God wants churches to have elders. Yeah. Period. I mean, and I say that because if anybody who's dealt with it, there are churches out there that have been in existence for decades and longer and so on, and they have never had elders, but they have somebody in the congregation who every time they think about having elders, they resist it. And of course, they're not qualified. The ones that resist typically are not qualified, and they would lose their influence if you have good, solid elders in the congregation. And I'm just giving an illustration. I mean, you could look at a lot of other types of scenarios, but we need to approach a church with understanding that, and that's why we call it scripturally organized. A scripturally organized church has elders as the shepherds, qualified men who are directing the congregation, shepherding the flock. And that's what God wants. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we are searching for those who to appoint. Because sometimes we let little technicalities get in the way of having elders. When good and well, there's 2 or 3 men that are capable and that are qualified, but there's just something that stands in their way of being able to get that thing started. And a lot of times it's not the elders themselves; it's deeper issues. So there's my can of worms. So.
Well, 2 things. I think we might have skipped, a pretty obvious point. We're talking about overseers and elders. We're always talking about plural because it's always mentioned in plural.
Sure.
So that's a key point to remember. We're not talking about one person, and that's what the denominational problem is. You get one pastor, and then he cheats on his wife, and then the whole church shuts down. Well, that wasn't God's design. There should be a plurality of pastors or elders or overseers, whatever term you want to use, to govern the Lord's church.
Yeah.
And I think,
Exactly.
Yeah, to Tom's point, I think when you start going through some of these, if people feel like they're not qualified or it's hesitant, for unity's sake, they will not serve as an elder because they want to keep the unity of the church, because that's the goal they have in mind, is whatever's best for the Lord's church. That's what they're going to do. Which almost makes them more qualified, right? Like you.
Well, here's my concern about that. And someone mentioned this earlier, kind of triggered it a little bit. If you have an individual who desires to serve as an elder, but he's listening to the objections of people who are viewing the qualifications as wrong, and he therefore says, okay, I won't serve because they don't think I'm qualified, although I see it completely different than I am, I would question his Bible knowledge. Okay? And what I mean by that is our role as elders is to shepherd the flock and teach them the Word of God and make sure they're leading right. But if a brother's misunderstanding of one of the qualifications keeps the congregation from having elders, then the men who desire to serve, they need to try to study with that one, because their knowledge should be enough where they can say, look, this is what the Bible teaches, and this is the qualification that God requires, not hold the church hostage to not having elders because one of the members has an incorrect understanding of something. So I guess if the elder himself questions whether or not he's qualified, despite the fact he understands what the text says, but he's being caused to doubt by someone else, then maybe he's not yet qualified, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know. Also, thank you, Joe, for bringing up Hebrews 13:17. That was on the chart, but I didn't really bring it up, and I forgot to do it, I should say. Hebrews 13:17 is one of those great passages that talk about elders without talking about elders. Because it clarifies, submit to those who have rule over you, for they watch out for your soul. So the question is, well, who is the one ruling over us, who watches out for our souls? That fits the description of the pastors, elders, overseers, and so forth.
Right. Okay, go ahead. I think you got something else, Joe?
No, it's not.
Brian did throw in there a little bit earlier that Ignatius kind of described the term elders is describing the man, the term overseer describes their place, and the term shepherd describes the job. That was one way that this has been viewed in the past by some there. And he does confirm that it was Ignatius who in his letters would address the single bishop over a congregation there as well. Yeah.
And Ignatius was relatively early too.
He was. Yeah.
They've got him recorded as dying around 135, 140, or actually some say even earlier than that.
Which I've kind of used him as an example where Paul, and he's talking to the Ephesian elders in Acts 20, and he says, even from among yourself, some would rise up teaching perverse things. Well, it's in his later letter to the church in Ephesus that he refers to a singular ruling bishop. Now, I can't say positively that it was the same group of people, okay? Or if maybe he just assumed that and they didn't have it. But if he is accurately reflecting the leadership there in Ephesus, that might have been what Paul was referencing when he gave them that warning there.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've never tied it to that. That's a good point. Yeah, a possibility. Because Paul is warning, from among yourself, men will rise, and that could be At a very minimum, it's the congregation, and it's also possible that it's the leadership. You
Yeah.
might even say probable.
Yeah, depending on how long they lived and when Paul met with them.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. I'm not intentionally avoiding Jimmy's question, but I am choosing to put it off until we get to that point in our text. So I guess there's a little bit of intent there. But let's go ahead and walk through some of these other things. We're going to try not to break it down to a very slow pace. Some of these things are fairly straightforward. But there in verse 2, he makes a point that, let me bring this up here, where he says, the bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach. The idea of being blameless, would we put that above the idea of being above reproach? Would you think this is in regards to sin specifically, or just in general moral behavior around other people?
When I see the word blameless, the first point that I want to make about this is notice where it is on the list.
Yeah.
It's the first thing on the list. There's a sense in which I think that word blameless applies to everything else on the list. And like I said, the idea is irreproachable. Now understand, that doesn't mean that if an accusation is made against an elder that he's disqualified. The question is, will it stick? And what is the accusation? Who's making it? And so you got to build all of that is. But basically the idea is you got to have somebody who's of a character that is worthy of respect, and that applies within the congregation and it applies within the community as well. So you have to have a degree of that. So.
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts on that?
Well, I think he's talking about character and teaching ability matter more than your status or your wealth. And can you teach the gospel? And are you respected among the people? There's no grounds for accusation. That doesn't mean accusations aren't going to come. Of course, he talks about, if you don't accept the accusation unless there's 2 or 3 witnesses, because people will always bring something against somebody in charge if they don't like them.
Yeah.
But is it sustainable, as Tom said?
Okay.
Yeah, probably the most accused individual in the Bible was Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, and obviously he was blameless. He was the epitome to the answer of the term blameless.
Okay.
We might also note that blameless does not mean sinless, as if the elder is some man who now has never sins in his life, but that where there is sin, it's dealt with quickly and appropriately by God's measure, and so that there is no accusation that can be legitimately held toward that person or upon that person.
Yeah.
In other words, if he's done something wrong, has he rectified it? Has he repented of it? Is that the pattern there? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I might add to that, it doesn't mean that as a man he doesn't have struggles.
Yeah.
It has to do with how he deals with those struggles and so on. Do they rule him or does he rule them?
Yeah.
Right. I think another point, you got to make with verse 2, and it's a controversial point that people bring up. And one of the reasons they disqualify people is they say, he's got to be a husband of one wife. Well, if his wife dies and he gets remarried, does that disqualify him? I don't think it's talking about that. I think it's talking about polygamy and adulterous relationships. But people will bring that up and say, well, his wife died when he was 25 and he got remarried when he was 30, and now, he's not qualified to be an elder. I don't think that's what it's talking about.
Right. Exactly.
Concerning that, without jumping away from blameless, unless it's simply an expression that means he's a married man. He's married. Is legitimately so before God. And a man whose wife has died and he's married again how many wives does he have? Well, he has one wife. He's married. Unfortunately, some have failed to see that simple expression as being he's to be a married man.
Yeah.
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 Because you think about this.
Yeah, we do look at
Go ahead, Tom.
the character of the wives a little later on. So.
Yeah.
The thing is, we know from Jesus that in heaven there's no marriage or given in marriage.
Right.
So it would be what, like Caleb talked about, the idea of polygamy. Clearly, you've got more than one wife. Or, in the case of point of someone who divorces his wife and it's not for scriptural grounds and marries another, well, he's living in adultery because technically, in the eyes of God, he's still bound to that first wife. So there you've got, but yeah, I agree with what you're saying, that once his wife dies, if he chooses to remarry, he still would be viewed as a husband of one wife.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good point.
Now the other question is, if you're serving as an elder and your wife passes away, do you have to step down as being an elder? I think this qualification would say you should step down until you remarry, or if you never remarry, then you don't have that office anymore.
Yeah, and that's my conviction on that. And again, I know there's again in the brotherhood there's debate on there's debate on every one of these qualifications, but we get caught up on all the familiar conversation, the familial qualifications. That's where I don't know if I use the term go off the rail, but we get bogged down. Yeah, we get bogged down with all of those kind of things. What about this? What about this exception? This exception, and that becomes a challenge.
Well, it brings back the question, or it brings forward the question. If in any of these qualifications, we know they must be present in order to serve. Well, once you're serving as an elder, must they be maintained? And I would suggest they must be maintained. If you had a man who's serving as an elder, and for whatever reason he begins to turn to alcohol, and he has a problem with alcohol for a period of time, he needs to step down until he has conquered that issue there. Or if you've got someone who, when he was serving, was not greedy for money, but he got a great job promotion, and for whatever reason, other influences in his life, he became clearly greedy for money. And it wasn't a one-time thing. It was now a way of looking at things. Maybe that individual needs to step down until he has back under control the issues being mentioned here. So I guess my point is, I think if a wife does die, the elder should step down. And then at some point, if he remarries. So I think the thing would be all the qualifications. If any of the qualifications a man fails to meet, I'm not saying a one-time misstep in judgment and he repents, but if he completely fails to meet this, and that's going to lead into our discussion about what Jimmy was asking here in a minute and the conditions there with that. But anyway, I don't know if that was helpful.
Yeah, and another side of this, dealing with a husband and one wife, is why does he need a wife? Well, he's going to be in circumstances where that wife is a part of his work. In a sense, when you think about, if you want to use the word counseling, counseling a woman, as an example of that, studying with a woman, those kind of things, and it's a part of his support system, from that standpoint. And by the way, that's why when we get to it, you've got some discussion about wives as you get the women, as you get a little. I believe it applies to both the deacon and the elder, but we'll get to that when we get to it. That kind of a thing. But that's the point. It's important that wife is a part of his support structure, and so if he remarries, his wife dies and he marries again, you have to look at the character of the woman he marries, and tie that in.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Let's see.
I think Brian makes a good point in the YouTube chat, if you want to pull that up.
Yeah, let's do that. He says the congregation needs to be in agreement on the subjective elements of the qualifications, emphasizing autonomy.
Yeah.
I think that, well,
Yeah,
that's part of the teaching process.
yeah. And I think it's important, if you agree on these things ahead of time. For a church, I serve with the church that haven't had elders ever. We have had men go on to be elders in other places, but 45 years we haven't had elders. And if you all agree on the qualifications, these subjective things beforehand, when people come up and they are qualified, you can't move the goalpost. The
Yeah.
goalpost is set by that local congregation. So, we agreed on this a long time ago. Now this person is eligible. We can't move the goalposts on them because we don't want to have elders per se.
Well, I knew a family years ago, an older couple who left the congregation, started attending elsewhere because they knew the gentleman who was being appointed as an elder, and I think it had to do with the fact that they were older than him. They just couldn't see him in that capacity. It wasn't anything to do with scriptural qualifications. It was their own personal feelings about it.
Yeah.
But I like that point. You can't move the goalpost once someone gets to that point of qualification. Yeah.
Which is illustrative of also teaching to a congregation about an eldership is the responsibility a congregation has to be submissive to the oversight and to those who are your shepherds. And such things as that is a very subjective, well, I just can't see because he's younger than I am, is not approaching any scriptural objection to the oversight of an eldership. So that element of the congregation's responsibility is also important as we teach about not only qualifications but the work of these men.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Well, I think, we could bring up David's comment in Facebook. He said, what happens to a church if they have no elders? And I think the important point to note is the elders are held to a higher standard. So if you have a church that doesn't have elders, every man in that congregation that's meeting and trying to do the best they can, they're all being held to a higher standard. If you're in a church that doesn't have elders, you should want to have elders because you're being held to a higher standard. You're going to be held to account for those things. And I think sometimes, as Tom said, you might have some domineering men that aren't qualified that want to keep their power. But it's a dangerous thing to have that position because you're going to be held to a higher standard by God.
The thing we have to keep in mind, and Caleb, this will fit with what you're saying. The majority of the qualifications given to the men who would desire to serve in this capacity are qualifications required of Christians in general. There are a few exceptions. If you're a woman, you're not going to be the husband of one wife, clearly. Okay. And if you don't have children, then there's no expectation of children being in subjection to you. But everything else fits within the parameters of a Christian's life, whether you're serving as an elder or not. So going back to what you're saying there, if you have men who are trying to make decisions of for a local congregation in the absence of elders, there's still a requirement that they must be make scriptural decisions in regard to that. God's going to expect them to do that because they're Christians in general, and this is what He requires of us. All right, let's see. A couple of the things, talk about being sober-minded and temperate, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach. The term hospitable, are we looking at this from the perspective of inviting people over to your house or a willingness to help someone who is in need? What are your thoughts about that?
Yes. Next point. No. I mean, I think it applies. I think it applies to both. And I think there's something to be said about priority where that is concerned too. And what I mean by that is, we've been studying in our class about Christians and good works, what it means to be a disciple and how good works are a part of that. And the Bible says our brethren are our priority. They take priority over the world But at the same time, you have opportunities to open doors when you're benevolent as an individual. And of course, another thing we've talked about in our class is the distinction between a congregation and an individual when it comes to what we are capable of or qualified to, or allowed to do, permitted from a scriptural standpoint. So you got to tie all those things in. So I think the idea of being hospitable is someone who's willing to help somebody that has a need. You know, the great illustration of that is your Luke 16, the Good Samaritan. I mean, Jesus is, you know, he's dealing with a Samaritan there, you know, and even though the text doesn't say the man that fell among thieves, it doesn't tell us his nationality. I believe it's implied in the text that it was a Jew, you know, from that standpoint.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Of course, able to teach. That says what it says in regards to his ability to teach. I don't think do you think he's talking here about verbal ability to verbally communicate in what we would consider as a polished speaker, or just someone who's able to teach, rightly handling the word of truth, able to teach the word?
And to a degree, he needs to be capable of engaging in a study, I think. But this doesn't necessarily mean he has to be a preacher. Or even the Bible class teacher. And I think this is one of the qualifications where Titus gives us a little more input, you know, insight to what you're talking about. They're over in Titus chapter 1, what is it, about verse 9, 8 and 9, where verse 9 talks about holding fast the faithful word as he has been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and convict those who contradict. And he goes on in verse 10, there are many insubordinate, both idle talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole households, teaching things they ought not for the sake of dishonest gain. And he goes on and he gives more illustration of that. I think that's the point. As an elder, he needs to know the word of God. You know, he needs to be grounded in the word of God so that he can spot the wolf. You know, the wolf that comes into their midst, and he not only can spot the wolf, but he knows how to stop the wolf. And that's the idea of the teaching. And obviously, it also comes down that if you've got somebody that needs advice, you got to be able to show them in God's word, give them direction with whatever their struggles are. So if somebody is not a Christian, and what do I need to do to become a Christian? You need to know God's plan of salvation a little deeper than just, there's 5 things you got to do. You know, I mean, you need to know the understanding behind it and be able to answer, you know, an argument, you know, or when somebody brings up an objection or a question about it, or at least know how to access the answer. And so when I see the able to teach, all of those things come to my mind.
Okay. All right. Tell you what, we are running down on our normal time limit, if we have a time limit, I guess. I do want to come back to touch on Jimmy's. I didn't intend to ignore Jimmy's, but I'm gonna give a quick answer to this, and y'all can let me know how y'all see it. Sorry, I sent the wrong one. Let's try it again. Well, there we go. What are your thoughts on someone that is an elder with older children, ones that have moved away, who falls away? Personally, in verse 5, it says, manage his own household. So should an elder who has a child that is gone be asked to step down? I knew an individual some years ago that kind of held the idea that a man wasn't qualified to serve as an elder unless the congregation had kind of seen him rear his children. And I don't know if so much as if I hold to that. But come back to Jimmy's questions. It is specific. A man, one who rules his own house well, that you only rule those who are within the household. If you have a member of a congregation and they move to another congregation, the elder no longer has oversight over them. So if they go to another congregation and they fall away, the elder here at this congregation where they formerly attended is not held accountable. and doesn't deal with the situation as the local eldership where they're at should. And so in this case of point, he kind of uses that comparison. So I personally believe that once kids leave the home and they're out on their own, they're no longer within their father's rule and authority there. And he's no longer accountable for the deeds. He can no longer be held accountable for the decisions that they make within their life. That's a short answer. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think you got to go. Go ahead, Joe. No, go ahead.
That's fine. Well, I agree with you, John. And the verse itself gives these parameters, rules, the idea of here's the exercise of authority, his own house, not someone else's. When a child moves out, now they establish their own house. In the context of the exercise of his rule, the children are in submission to that rule with reverence or dignity. So some have conflated the rule over the house with the ongoing influence and example of a father, in spite of the fact that children have moved out and established their own houses. That's not what is being described here. Rule and influence are two different things. The exercise of authority is the idea of rule here, where submission occurs. You don't submit to an influence. You may be affected by it, but those are two different things. And sometimes that conflation occurs and has led to disruptions and dissensions and divisions in churches, unfortunately.
That's a good point.
Yeah. I think you got to go to Titus 1 in verse 6, because it says you have to be having children who believe. Mm-hmm. I think is what people would refer to. If your children all move away and they all fall away, then what kind of leadership did you have as a father growing up? Well, I think as long as you have at least one child that believes, then I still think you're qualified.
That's true, and yet at the same time, understand that as they move away, let's say they're 20 years faithful and then they fall away, we have to recognize many other influences that have been brought to bear upon that person during those intervening times. So to keep it in the context of rule well his own house, here's the scenario that indicates his ability to rule the church, as he goes on to explain. So I know those things are brought up, and there's a lot of the what ifs and what abouts, and I think Brian's point also is worthy of consideration there as we look at this overall point.
Yeah, and just to be reminded, Brian's point was there has to be agreement in the congregation, and that's the big thing about it. And of course, the challenge with that is the attitude that the congregation has when it comes to agreeing.
Which speaks to the bigger point of the unity of oneness of mind and judgment.
Exactly.
And the respect of those things. It's a challenge, as you mentioned earlier, no question.
Because Jimmy's question, it is one that, depending on who you talk to, you're going to get different answers. There are some that say all children have to remain faithful the rest of their life, and then it leads back to the question of what is faithful.
Well, to put it in simple terms, are we going to apply an impossibility of apostasy to the children of an elder who move away, and yet teach that we don't believe in the impossibility of apostasy? So we have to keep it within the context of explanation that the Spirit has provided us there, while recognizing that there may be situations where, given time frame and so forth, it may be a reflection upon the man's rule of his own house. It requires diligence. It requires patience in studying these things, but also, of course, overall keeping God's word as helping us to define and apply, so that we can have leaders, elders in a congregation who demonstrate the ability to rule God's people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was looking at one more question, and Caleb, you kind of touched on this a little bit, and we're almost done. But Stephanie Holly earlier asked, if an elder divorces his wife for fornication and then remarries a faithful woman, I feel like he still would not meet the qualifications. Am I correct? And this comes back to our discussion of the husband of one wife. If he's put her away for the purpose of adultery, then God allows him to remarry someone else and not be living in adultery. And the only way you can have that situation is if you are the husband of one wife. And so if he lawfully puts her away for that cause, then he would be free to remarry. And that free to remarry would have to be because he's no longer considered married to her in the eyes of God. And whoever he marries now becomes his one wife.
Yeah, her clarifying point was he would fail in his leadership of the household if she were to do that. Of course, I can lead a horse to water. That doesn't mean he's going to drink it. You know, I know faithful men and that come to church every service, and their wife is not faithful. So, obviously he's not qualified. Yeah, but
in other words, what she's saying is he may not be above reproach, because some people may question whether or not he was a godly husband to his wife, or if he drove his wife away from him.
Right.
Yeah, and that is part of a challenge. The other side is, and not getting technical with things, but the reply to that, notice how failed is past tense. Not that it was necessarily meant that way. I mean, if you divorce a wife and you, for scriptural reasons and so on, like I said, there's parameters in there that you got to know what the parameters were. But then when he marries again, how is he proving himself? You know,
and is he eternally condemned to never serve again? I mean,
yeah, and those are the challenges with all of this. So
yeah.
All right. Well, the good thing is we don't have to answer those questions right now because of time. But go ahead, Joe. We do have. Go ahead.
Oh no, I'm not sure I had a follow-up comment. I think that you made the point. Several have is that a deliberate study of all of this before appointing elders is imperative for a congregation to take the time to study these out, look at these things. I think one of the things that sometimes comes to mind, and it may have been alluded to earlier, is that sometimes there's so much of an emphasis upon the family qualifications that we may fail to adequately address the other qualifications as well, not to diminish one over the other, that they all have their value and importance, and so all of them need to be judiciously considered as men are considered to be appointed as overseers.
You know, certain things are more obvious to notice. Other things are not as obvious. And what you're talking about, those things we kind of tend to focus our attention on, but like the not given to wine or not greedy for money, but gentle. Some of those things could fly under the radar because they're not as obvious as some of the other ones, and we don't spend the time with them.
Right.
It's a good point, Joe. Good point.
Yeah.
All right, I'll tell you what, let's plan to continue this next week, and especially once Brian gets back, he'll straighten us all out. He'll get everything where it needs to be down the track there. Do we want to start with verse 6 next week? Is there anything else we need to talk about in regards to 4 and 5 as far as ruling his own house well?
We might. I think there might be a couple of things that we ought to just kind of touch on, With,
all right.
with
so if I put down that we'll start at verse 4, that means we only covered 3 verses in today's study.
I'm going to tell you right now, qualifications of elders, that's pretty good.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. All right, we'll plan to do that then. Next Thursday, Lord willing, we will continue here with 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 4. In 2 weeks, we won't have a study. I have a responsibility locally that I need to take care of, but that's 2 weeks away. So next Thursday, 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 4. Joe, I appreciate you joining us. I'm glad Tom let you. When I was out there, he wouldn't let me.
Oh, well.
Of course, we didn't have the study either.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for letting me be on. I've enjoyed and appreciated it.
Well, we appreciate you. Appreciate all your comments for sure. Anything else? All right, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to send them our way. Send them to questions@truthfactor.com, or you can email us individually. And if it's something that maybe pertains to a study and it's something we can answer in our next study, we will do our best to do that. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you back here again next Thursday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time for another Truth Factor discussion. Y'all have a wonderful week.